Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, drug shortages affecting cancer treatment. Dr. Amanda Nickles Fader, an oncologist at Johns Hopkins, speaks to Dr. Josh Sharfstein about her scramble to find the medicines her patients need. They're joined by Dr. Mariana Socal of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's been studying what's behind these shortages. Let's listen.
Dr. Fader, Dr. Socal, thank you so much for joining me to talk about drug shortages, an urgent national problem. Let's start with you, Dr. Fader. Tell us where you work in clinic.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. So I am a GYN oncologist at Johns Hopkins, and my specialty is to treat women with gynecologic or reproductive cancers, so cancers of the uterus, ovary, cervix, and vulva.
Those are some pretty serious medical conditions.
Yes, indeed. It's a huge passion of mine. Women's cancers are underfunded, and many of them present as with advanced stage disease. So a really big clinical unmet need to improve outcomes for women with cancer.
So I imagine you'd like to spend your time really working to find new treatments, new cures for your patients, but you've been spending a lot of time on this issue of drug shortages. Why is that?
Yeah, that's right. We've made so many treatment advances in the last decade that are extending survival and improving quality of life for patients with cancer. And chemotherapy drugs are among the most important medicines that we use to treat cancer. And it's one of the most important tools I have as an oncologist to help my patients. However, currently we're facing a significant shortage of these essential medicines to help treat our patients. In that in the United States right now, we have a shortage of 15 indispensable chemotherapy drugs.
What does that mean for patients?
Well, it's usually problematic for patients because the drugs that are in most significant shortage are among the most utilized drugs to treat the vast majority of cancers out there in adults and children. So not only the cancers that I treat, the gynecologic cancers, but lung, breast, bladder, leukemia, testicular cancers, the list goes on. And so these are curative intent treatments, meaning that when we use these treatments, either alone or in combination with other novel therapies, we can have a significant chance of cure in a number of patients.
But you have to use the medicines. I guess what I'm getting at is what happens when a drug is in shortage? A patient comes to you, they're diagnosed with uterine cancer, and a drug is in shortage. Does that mean they still get it, but it takes a little while? What actually happens?
So shortage can mean different things for different institutions. It can mean that an institution or hospital is completely out of a drug or that we're running low on supplies. And so then in that latter instance, we have to be really responsible in terms of how we use the drug supply that we have. So sometimes that means we just use practices at the pharmacy level where we preserve every last drop of chemotherapy and make sure that none of it goes wasted so we can increase the mileage of the treatment over more patients. Or we adjust doses or extend the intervals of treatment. In other words, if a treatment is usually given every 3 weeks, we might give it every 4 weeks, or we might make small, tiny doses to the dose adjustments to the treatment that won't necessarily make a difference in outcome. These are still very effective ways of delivering these drugs, but it will help us preserve those drugs longer.
Have there been cases where you haven't been able to give the drugs that you think the patients need for their cancer?
Well, fortunately, I haven't had to do that. However, at our institution and at many other across the country, since we think over 90% of hospital systems across the country now are impacted by the current chemotherapy drug shortage, we've sometimes had to make some adjustments in terms of, again, the dosing or the interval of the drugs, or we might switch a patient to a drug that is in the same class and works just as well as the drug that's in shortage, but perhaps it has a higher side effect profile, or it takes longer to administer, so the patient has to spend more time in the hospital to get the treatment. So there's certainly some trade-offs there, but For other diseases and for other cancers, there may not be a good alternative drug to substitute if one of those critical drugs is in shortage. So it can be a real problem for patients.
So at a minimum, it is enormous amount of work for you and your team to try to keep the plates spinning when drugs are hard to come by, it sounds like. But also it could be that patients have to take medicines with more side effects or require longer hospitalization. So it is already affecting patient care in your clinic, even if it's not the most dire scenario that I think you're trying to prevent.
Yes, we're certainly seeing that across many different hospitals and different settings in the US, yes.
Dr. Socal, you are an expert in the drug supply and supply chain. What's going on that so many cancer drugs are in short supply, not to mention other types of drugs, where doctors like Dr. Fader are spending time just trying to provide the essential medications to their patients when it should be automatic?
Well, thank you for that question. And, unfortunately, drug shortages have become part of the day-to-day operations in many of our hospital systems and across many specialties, not only oncology, but also infectious disease, shortages of antibiotics, shortages of drugs that are very important for intensive patient care, sedatives, even life-saving drugs very frequently for these intensive care patients. And those overall drug shortages have been a problem that have been present in our healthcare system for several years. And generally speaking, we see these problems occurring when there have been manufacturing problems with drugs. I think that's pretty much what's happening today with these chemotherapy agents, where there have been manufacturing problems in certain plants. Even one drug manufacturer sometimes having a problem can bring intensive disruption to the entire market for that drug.
What's behind these manufacturing problems?
Well, typically there's information from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and others who have investigated this in more depth. But there is one type of drug that is generic drugs. So these are drugs that they are not protected by a patent. So we can have many different manufacturers manufacturing the same product and competing in the same market. Also, typically generic drugs are cheaper than other drugs that are under patent. So these cheap products, or at least cheaper compared to very expensive other drugs we have out there, right? They are the ones that have been historically more vulnerable to having manufacturing problems. I would summarize the rationale for this as saying, if you have 4 or 5 different companies that manufacture the same product, how would they compete in the market? Well, it's like any other market, right? They compete for price, and each of them is continuously trying to offer a lower and lower and lower price for their drugs. And then by doing so, there's also not an incentive for these companies to invest, in new machinery, better practices for their facilities, renovations in the facilities, and so on. The way that the pricing structure and the market competition works doesn't necessarily lead to incentives for improvements in the manufacturing practices for these drugs. Then what you see as a result is every so often you can hear about a facility or a company having problems with that.
Right. There's an inspection that goes awry, and then the factory can't make their medication anymore. I guess I want to ask you, Dr. Fader, whether this story rings true to you. Are the drugs that are more likely in shortage to be the new, most expensive drugs, or are they ones that you take for granted? They've been around for a while, but are critical for treating patients?
That's right. I agree with Dr. Socal. It's the older school, what we call the cytotoxic chemotherapy drugs that are now primarily generic formulations that are in shortage, those that are off patent, if you will. And they remain among the most critical drugs we use. Again, they are part of that chemotherapy backbone that we build upon and add new therapies to. They've been around, some of them, for more than 2 or 3 decades, but still some of the most highly effective drugs that we use to treat cancer.
So we have an unusual situation where it's the drugs we take for granted, the drugs that have been part of your arsenal, Dr. Fader, for years, suddenly disappearing from the shelves and forcing you to really scramble to be able to provide the care that you think your patients need. And you have these incentives that Dr. Socal is describing of cutting costs, not necessarily investing in quality that may be creating or contributing to these problems. I guess, Dr. Socal, what's to be done here?
Well, whenever we talk about drug supply, we always use the expression drug supply chain, right? And it's important that we remember that there's a real chain of events happening behind the scenes that ultimately result in the drug being available or not in the pharmacy shelf or in the hospital's inventory. And this supply chain typically starts far away from the United States. So, for example, if you take the ingredients that are necessary to produce a generic drug, there is a key component that is called the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and that's the chemical part that will really exert the clinical effect on the patients. And our research here at Hopkins has found that over 85% of all of these active ingredients that are needed to produce generic drugs for the US, they're actually produced overseas. So, there is an element here of not only manufacturing and manufacturing with quality, but also transportation and also reaching a second player, a second entity, which is the facilities that will then manufacture the finalized product, maybe mix it with a solution to be delivered in the patient's veins or produce it in a tablet or so on. So there's multiple steps in this supply chain that are prone to quality problems. Not only problems with manufacturing the finalized product, but also sometimes all the way back to manufacturing that active substances. And it is very important also, I think alluding to something that Dr. Fader mentioned, is that not only manufacturing is an issue, which products we are purchasing are an issue. So one, of course, we need to monitor and ensure that manufacturing practices happen with quality, but also are we purchasing the products that are produced with better quality practices? And that's something that today we have no way to know.
And so getting more information on quality might be an important step. Setting stronger policies to assure quality might be a stronger step. Do you think we should be paying more for drugs? Now, I'm not saying every drug paid more. This is not like the flip of every other podcast where we talk about reducing drug prices. But for some drugs, do you think we're paying too little, Dr. Socal?
I do think that. However, I think I should also mention that it's very well known that our prices are not transparent. Sometimes we don't know exactly how much we're paying for these drugs. Not only prices could be higher to incentivize these practices, but also the final prices should be actually known. It's often assumed that for generics, we know how much we're paying, but that's not always the case. There's often several layers of lack of transparency that play out here. Even if for face value, we're paying a reasonable price, sometimes that's not the price that is actually reaching the manufacturer because others can make a cut, others that participate in the supply chain for these drugs.
Dr. Fader, how are you feeling about the chances of this getting turned around?
Well, Josh, we're starting to see some improvement in the short term. The FDA is actively working with manufacturers and distributors to increase supply quickly. The agency is working with manufacturers to expand production of the drugs by expediting review of new manufacturing facilities. It's approving importation of some of these drugs from overseas to help bolster the supply. But other than the companies coming back online and producing the drugs that we need, I'm not confident right now that we have a good long-term strategy here. This is just a Band-Aid. And I'm really, really worried for my patients that this could keep happening and could potentially worsen with each shortage, given what we're seeing now. And so it's really vital that we see long-term strategies enacted. Oncologists like me, patient advocates, we really want to be at the table to help with those solutions.
Well, you have been very vocal about this, Dr. Fader, talking in different press events, talking to reporters, getting the word out. Maybe not what you thought when you did a residency and fellowship training?
No, it isn't, but I'm learning a great deal. And I think one of the good things that can come out of this is not taking for granted the supplies and resources that we have in modern medicine to help our patients, and how can we be better stewards of those supplies and medicines.
Well, we have to solve this problem for patients and for clinicians like you so that you can go back to doing what you do best and what you train for, which is to discover some amazing and new therapies for people who really need it. Thank you to both of you so much for joining, Dr. Fader, Dr. Socal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.